Welcome and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be. Before we begin, for those of us in Toronto, we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. For those of you who are logging in from elsewhere, we'd also invite you to reflect on your own relationship to the land you inhabit and the complex histories of colonialism that have shaped it. This attention to the present life of history is central to the project that the Belt and Road in Global Perspective, led by Professor Ed Schatz, is bringing today to you in this talk and our speaker. This project, the Belt and Road in Global Perspective, aims to take stock of the rapidly developing and widely varying changes that are occurring in the wake of China's Belt and Road Initiative. It brings scholarly expertise to bear on understanding these massive transformations that are underway across Asia and Eurasia. The project is part of a burgeoning partnership between the National University of Singapore, Nazarbayev University, and the University of Toronto. So before I turn it over to today's speaker, we'd like to thank the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and the extraordinary staff for all of their support in making today happen. We'd also like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for their support. Finally, I'd like to thank the Department of Geography and Planning's Intersection Speaker Series for co-sponsoring today's talk. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph McQuade, who will interview Professor Laleh Khalili about her new book. Joseph is the Richard Charles Lee Postdoctoral Fellow at the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and he's the Digital Content Manager for the Belt and Road in Global Perspective Partnership Project. Dr. McQuade completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge with a dissertation that is now his first book, titled A Genealogy of Terrorism, Colonial Law, and the Origins of an Idea, recently published by Cambridge University Press. And with that, I will turn it over to Joseph, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to everyone who is in the audience today, to everyone who is maybe watching this in the future, watching the recording, but especially a thank you to our speaker today, Laleh Khalili. It really is a delight to be able to pick your brain and talk to you about this fantastic book that I've had the opportunity to read. First, I'd just like to introduce Professor Khalili to the audience. So Laleh Khalili is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. She completed her PhD in politics at Columbia University after a background in engineering and management consulting. Her early work examined representations and practices of violence and has appeared in two highly acclaimed books. So the first, Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, which was with Cambridge Press in 2007. And the second, with Stanford Press in 2013, Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgency. She was also co-editor for a volume with Gillian Schwedler titled Policing and Prisons in the Middle East, Formations of Coercion, and that was published with Hearst. She's written numerous articles in a wide variety of different outlets and platforms on subjects ranging from the politics of pleasure and gendered subjectivities to trade, collective memory, and the role of happiness in counterinsurgencies, inter alia. So Professor Khalili's work draws on archival and ethnographic methods, and she's interviewed bureaucrats, military officers, former prisoners, refugees, and guerrillas over the course of her career. While her geographic area of interest is the Arab world, with research drawing on her use of Arabic and Persian language sources, throughout her work, we can really see a deep attention to the interconnections between internal politics and geopolitical asymmetries, as well as the region's connections both eastward and westward. Before coming to Queen Mary, she taught at undergraduate, postgraduate, and doctoral levels at SOAS for 15 years. And her teaching, like her research, draws from really an impressive breadth of expertise on topics such as political violence, struggles over infrastructures, gender, culture, politics of resistance, as well as teaching broad surveys on comparative and international politics of the Middle East, ethics of research, and a range of other subjects. So today we'll be discussing her new book, Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, which was published by Verso just last year in 2020. So this book examines the role of maritime infrastructures as conduits of movement of technologies, capital, people, and cargo. In it, Professor Khalili deftly explores an impressive web of connected topics, from the intricacies of derivatives to the ecological impacts of dredging and the securitization of migrant labor. In reading through this wonderful book, I was struck by how well Professor Khalili binds the historical to the contemporary, bringing the reader back and forth really quite seamlessly through the various economic and technological transformations of the 19th and 20th century, as well as leading right up to the present, in a way that contextualizes the centrality of shipping to the making of global capitalism. I was also struck by the relevance of the book to our own work at the Belt and Road in Global Perspective project, which seeks to explore what we refer to as the downstream or the mid-range and local effects of the much lauded but under-theorized Belt and Road Initiative inaugurated by Xi Jinping in 2013. So I want to briefly lay out three aspects of the book that I found especially relevant for these discussions. But I really do also want to strongly encourage everyone to pick up a copy of it and read it. It's not only a deeply interesting book, but it really is beautifully written. I really enjoyed reading it and then rereading it in preparation for this talk. So I really do recommend it. So just three themes that I wanted to kind of very briefly touch on before we launch our discussion. So the first is that it seems to me that a lot of scholarship on the Belt and Road Initiative focuses more on the terrestrial infrastructure of roads, highways, bridges, and railways. Well, this book does an excellent job of highlighting the scale and significance of oceanic trade routes in the past and today. So the oceanic dimension of this Belt and Road Initiative, called the Maritime Silk Road, is at least as important as the Eurasian so-called belt projects, but it's often less rigorously understood. So by providing such a rich account of the sinews of global trade, knitting the Arabian Peninsula to oceanic routes and passages throughout the 20th century, the book really reminds us that although the tendrils of oceanic trade routes are less visible than this kind of terrestrial infrastructure, that doesn't make them less relevant. And in fact, in many cases, they actually play an even more significant role in the movement of goods, of peoples, of technologies, of ideas, all kinds of things. So the second point I wanted to raise is that by exploring the colonial roots of shipping networks, practices, and disciplinary regimes in the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, the book also provides us with a rich array of historical context that really is often easily ignored in accounts that see the BRI as something wholly novel. So when we read these kind of breathless accounts of the unprecedented scope and ambition of China's infrastructural initiatives, it can lull us into believing that we're studying something without historical precedent. And certainly there are important ways in which the BRI marks a departure from older British, American, and post-colonial infrastructure projects in the region. And this is something that Laleh has also talked about a bit in a review she wrote in the London Review of Books, as well as I think elsewhere. So I think we'll talk more about that. But nonetheless, I do think it's really valuable how the book provides us with a kind of long-term perspective and a rigorous conceptual grounding that I think can enrich our understanding of the current moment that we inhabit as being part of these longer-term processes that predate the kind of 2013 inauguration of this specific project. And finally, the text foregrounds issues of labor, ecology, and the local impacts of global processes in a way that is, I think, quite rich and very much in line with how our project at U of T is looking to approach the Belt and Road Initiative. One theme that comes through in this book is the idea that local politics and strategic calculations are not only shaped by these massive infrastructural projects of route making and port building, but also in turn shape these processes in significant ways. In this sense, the book is kind of operating from at least two distinct vantage points. On the one hand, highlighting the effects of high-level decision-making on local flows of migration and labor, as well as on the development of local infrastructure and often the degradation of local ecology, while on the other hand, also showcasing the ways in which these local factors can in turn influence the kinds of decisions that are made and the kinds of projects that are embarked upon by authorities, whether in London, Washington, or Beijing. So that's more than enough for me. And I'd like to turn the conversation over to you now, Laleh, and invite you to say a little bit about your new book for those in our audience who may not have read it yet. And so specifically, what led you to this topic? What are some of the key insights of this new research? And what are some of the connections to your earlier work on counterinsurgency and confinement in the so-called global war on terror?
Thank you so much, Joseph, for such an incredibly generous introduction. I usually send a very short bio, so because I get very embarrassed when long bios are given, but that was unbelievably kind of you. I also want to thank Rachel and Ed for inviting me, the Munk School, as well as the various other organizations sponsoring this, including the Department of Geography. And I want to say hello to Deb and Jens, who are in the audience, along with other friends. So thank you so much to the audience for coming and being here. So in response to your question, okay, so I am a bit of a magpie, and when I recently interviewed for the job at Queen Mary, the question that was the hardest to answer was exactly what connects all of these different things that you've done. You've done gender and pleasure, you've done the situation of Palestinians and the commemorative practices they engage in, you've done counterinsurgency, and now you're doing maritime transport in the Arabian Gulf. What is the thread that connects all of this? And thankfully, somebody had asked me that question when I was prepping for the job interview. And I actually did have a response. And the response is a genuine one. So it's not just an interview response kind of made up. It's the transnational. For me, what is really, really significant and the thread that runs through a lot of the projects that I work on is two things. One, that I want to locate the sites of my study, whether that site of study is the commemorative practices of Palestinians from the time of the 1960s all the way to the present time, or whether it's the counterinsurgency practices of the British and the Americans and the French and the Israelis, or whether it is the ways in which maritime transport in the Arabian Peninsula has taken shape over the course of especially in the 20th century. I want to locate that in broader global webs of relation, and whether those webs of relation are about ideas, they're about ideologies, they're about solidarity movements, they're about military doctrine, or they're about the movement of capital and cargo and people. It's been enormously important for me to actually make those kinds of connections eastward, westward, to the global north and to the global south through relations of imperial and colonial past, through solidarity relations, horizontal and vertical relations. So that's and in part that has been because as friends who are in the audience and who have worked on the Middle East can tell you, Middle East is often exceptionalized. Theory emerges out of Latin America or out of Eastern Europe, and it becomes universal theory. That's not even to talk about Western Europe. European theory. Whereas Middle East is often siloed into an area. And for me, it was really important to locate it in these broader global sets of relations in order to de-exceptionalize the politics of the area. And that is one theme that runs through all of my work. The second the theme that runs through is a kind of a methodological, but also a political and ethical commitment. And that is that, you know, we live, I have personally lived through times of enormous seismic changes. I'm an Iranian and I lived through the Iranian Revolution. And I'm deeply aware of the ways in which such seismic macro-political historical events shape the micro-political, the often forgotten. And this comes out of a feminist commitment. You know, a lot of feminist scholarship is very committed to the idea of connecting the macro-political and the macro-historical to the micro-political, to the lives of the everyday, so sort of to the forgotten. And so that has also been a theme that has connected everything. For me, you know, whether it was sort of settler colonialism and then sort of third worldist movements in the first instance, or anti-colonial struggles in the second book, or now the transformation of the, you know, global infrastructures in the global South, it was really important to talk about how that has cascaded down to the lives of, say, the refugees or political prisoners, or in this instance, sailors and dock workers and people who live in the cities next to the port. So those two themes, I think, connect the broader, slightly magpie-ish, looking all over the place kinds of projects that I've been doing over the course of the last 20 years.
Sure, thanks so much. Yeah, and I think that especially, I mean, thinking about your work on confinement, for example, and kind of as you identify with the transnational nature of that project, but I think also there is really this kind of logistic type approach that's taken as well. And so that was also something that struck me in reading this as well. And then of course in Sinews of War and Trade, we do also get some of this discussion of counterinsurgency when we talk about the expansion of roads and things like that, and how they're used in places like Oman as ways of kind of consolidating power. So yeah, certainly I think that those threads, I can definitely kind of attest to those threads certainly being kind of noticeable. Yeah.
That's a very insightful thing to notice also, is that it is true that for me, it's been really important to talk about the ways in which violence has shaped, you know, the infrastructures, because both the science of logistics and also actually some of these fundamental modern infrastructural projects. And in fact, the very terminology in the Anglophone world of infrastructure has a military element to it. As Deb Cowan has written, the science of logistics emerges out of this combination of both sort of commercial capitalist impulse to manage things, but also comes out of military logistics. And so I think it was really important to not forget that violent thread that runs through what is often talked about as being a kind of a necessary furniture of our lives, which are infrastructures.
For sure. This is, I mean, this is really one of the angles that I've come to be interested in infrastructure, as well as really from kind of a background in looking at the history of colonial India. And of course, so, you know, you reference Africa and the roads there, and the railroads, and how they're primarily designed either for kind of exporting raw goods, importing kind of manufactured commodities that are being dumped by European colonial powers, or especially for moving troops. And that's certainly true in the Indian subcontinent as well. And what we also see there is this, this relationship between kind of the discursive making of these categories of piracy and thuggee and other groups, dacoites, and how that is very much linked to these projects of infrastructure and these projects of consolidating British control, especially in the wake of the rebellion of 1857. And I mean, I won't get totally into that, but yeah.
But that's so spot on. And that's also, I really love the fact that you bring up the idea of the thuggee and the sort of the subversive, because in fact, and you tie it to the question of piracy, because in fact, one of the things that was really striking to me, and one of the things that I discovered as I was doing all of the research for Sinews, as I was sort of putting finishing touches on some articles that came out of the counterinsurgency project, was how much of the law, for example, around piracy piracy and terrorism mutually constitute each other. So contemporary law, which assigns certain kinds of behavior as being terrorist or outside the pale, also assigns certain kinds of activity on the sea as being piracy, and again, beyond the pale. And the law, of course, emanates from the colonial center. And so much of that is similar to the kinds of stuff that you're talking about, for example, about the thuggees in India. So absolutely, that's actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a really nice convergence between your interests and mine. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was definitely struck by that with the book as well. And with kind of, this is so important to the consolidation of British rule in India, also with the making of things like criminal tribes. And so it's very much kind of grounded in this desire to regulate movement and to have this kind of predictable, taxable, governable colonial subject. And I think that what you also do really well in the book is this kind of bridging this and taking us into the post-colonial, and also looking at how this is, it's a colonial process, but it's also a state formation process. And it's also something that really carries through into the post-colonial period. And if we're looking at, again, places like Oman, I know is one of the specific kind of case studies that you use, but really in a range of other contexts as well, how many of these kind of colonial infrastructural logics really kind of carry through within the post-colonial states, and then kind of right through up to the present day. And once we kind of turn, I do have a few more questions I want to ask specifically about the book before we go to BRI, but just it would be interesting maybe to return to that thought later on in thinking also about, is this also some, what dynamic is at play here with the creation of the Belt and Road as well. But maybe I'll shelve that for the moment, just because I did have a question on kind of more on method and on kind of the conceptual grounding of the book that I did want to get to. And that is just, so I liked how you present the material along the lines of Michael Pearson's description of an amphibious story that moves between the land and the sea. And one thing that I really liked in the book was showing how the making of harbors is intimately connected to both the physical infrastructure of roads and railways leading in and out along the terrestrial approaches, as well as this more conceptual process of route making and navigation that prescribes the oceanic journeys of ships along the Arabian Sea and beyond. And so one thing that I thought I really noticed was rather than looking at the ocean from the shoreline, as many oceanic histories still do, what you really do that's so interesting is prioritize looking at the shore from the ocean. And you do this kind of literally in terms of traveling on some of the vessels that you describe, but also kind of more theoretically as well, I think. And so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about some of the methodological challenges that you encountered in writing this kind of amphibious history, as well as just kind of reflecting on, did this inversion of perspective reframe the way that you looked at both land and sea?
So that's a fantastic question, and a little bit difficult to answer, but I'll go on ahead and try anyway. So there were two different sets of decisions that had to be made. One had to do with what to do in the field, what sorts of research methods were going to be useful in order to collect the kind of stories, data, histories, information, ethnographies, archival material that I wanted. And again, because I was doing the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, but I was situating it in a broader set of relations. For me, the field wasn't just the countries on the Arabian Peninsula or the main cities, port cities there, but also, of course, the archives that the colonial archives, the imperial US archives, but also the interconnections between, for example, Dubai and Singapore, or the interconnections between Hong Kong and the various ports here, but also significantly places that we don't often think of when we think of these interconnections. Manila is enormously important because so many of the seafarers that crew the ships today are Filipinos. And so I had to go to Manila. I mean, it's a really good excuse also to travel when you've got the funding. But also the places where, for example, Dubai Ports World, which is a port management company, set up shop. So I ended up traveling, for example, to Cochin and Mumbai and a few other ports that the Dubai Ports World has stakes in. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was to travel on board a ship, because it was really important important also to see if I was going to be talking about the seafarers, and if I was going to have this conceit of looking at the shore from the sea, then I literally had to do that. That was one reason. But the second reason was also that some of these ports are highly securitized. So the port of Jabal Ali in Dubai, which is the largest port in the Middle East and the only port that appears in the top 10 list of container ports in the world beyond Asia and Southeast Asia, I couldn't get into it to interview anybody. Anybody who worked in the free zone or as part of the port just wouldn't, the security process to get into Jabal Ali was unbelievably difficult. So that was, but I managed to arrive in Jabal Ali on a ship twice. And so that was that literally facilitated some of that process. And then you get to, when you arrive into the port, I think I was the only passenger who'd ever gotten off at Jabal Ali. And I was certainly the only woman passenger who'd ever gotten off at Jabal Ali. And so going through the process of crossing the border into Dubai, into the Emirate of Dubai at Jabal Ali port was quite an interesting experience as well. And it was in fact so distinct that when I did it the second time, the border guy actually remembered who I was. Hey, you were here last year too. So that was before he even saw my passport and the specific Jabal Ali stamp in it, which is also a really great thing to have on one's passport. But then there were also countries which I couldn't come into because I was denied visas. I'm Iranian, and I was denied a visa to Bahrain twice, and I was denied a visa to Saudi Arabia. And so I actually managed to arrive in Saudi Arabia, but unfortunately not Bahrain, by being on a ship that stopped at Jeddah. And again, when you do that, what you're also seeing is the experience of the seafarers in arriving into a port that, for example, does not allow them to get off the ship. And therefore, you know, that getting off the ship is actually kind of a rest away from work. And so you can't do that in Jeddah. And that experience was also quite interesting for me. So that was in terms of the field collection of data and the methodological choices you had to make. And it was both about expanding the field in which I was researching, but also the modalities of engagement with the people that were involved in it. And then there was a conceptual thinking about this. And I had to think about what was important about the way that maritime transport infrastructures operated in the Arabian Peninsula. And inevitably, that had something to do with oil. You can't talk about the Arabian Peninsula and not talk about oil. But it wasn't the only thing that mattered. The second thing that was really important was the role that colonialism, in the shape of a protectorate with most of the Emirates around the Gulf, and direct colonization in the case of Aden had played. And what was interesting about that was that these were some of the last places to become truly independent, you know, some of them 1971. And so it was, you know, that experience of colonial control was within the living memory of a lot of people that I interviewed. And so that was also quite a significant, it had to be incorporated. And finally, as I said, the macro political had to be married to the micro political. The route making and the big infrastructure building and the colonial conceits and engineering of the labor regimes had to be married to the experience of the technical experts and the engineers and the port managers, and most importantly, the seafarers and port workers who had worked in these ports. Some of that information, for example, conversations with port workers, was really, really difficult to secure in some of these ports, Jabal Ali being actually one. And I tried different things. So going to the particular neighborhood in Dubai, which, you know, Filipinos live, and trying to get enough of a relations of trust built to be able to get stories, or talking to Filipinos who had gone back to Manila to talk to them about it. Some of it required being on a ship and talking to seafarers, and some of it required the archives, because that was really the only way to access some of these histories. It was really important for me to actually incorporate a lot of poetry and novels, because there is, this is a terrible thing, because my friends in literature will think that we're sociologically kind of looting, you know, literary works. But for me, actually, the texture and the richness and the historical grounding and this kind of a micro political that is embedded in literature was itself a wonderful beacon for understanding. So those were certain methodological choices about how to conceptually approach the project, which went hand in hand with the decision about how to define my field and what sort of field research to do.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that it's so interesting because there does seem to be just something that is so kind of human and so evocative about the sea. It really kind of conjures, all this kind of literary output and poetry, and the experience of those who are kind of shipboard. This is something that I've been reading the memoirs of this Indian revolutionary from the teens and 20s and 30s, Rash Bihari Bose, and he describes his experience of kind of fleeing British India on board this ship, and really kind of discusses it with a kind of richness. And so I definitely I did enjoy those parts as well, the kind of inclusion of the literary and the poetry. And I think that also it really does connect to kind of what you were describing about just the difficulty of access for some of these themes. And so this does become a way of incorporating these perspectives that I thought was really great. And so in terms of this question of access as well and securitization, I actually wanted to just return to that for a moment. And I don't have kind of I may not actually have anything articulate here, but I did just want to return to that, because it was another thing that struck me in the book is the way that you kind of explore these different, I don't want to call them invisible, because that's not what I'm actually getting at, but these, I guess, less well known is what we can say in terms of both the kind of the individuals, as well as the processes, as well as even the environments. Like you talk a lot about how many of these ports, I mean, when we think of ports and harbors, we tend to think of, city center port, like dockyards, in Manhattan, for example, and you really kind of show how so many of these have been very kind of externalized, but then also kind of highly securitized, highly fenced in, highly contained, so that they're very actually difficult to access. And I just wondered if there was maybe if you could speak a little bit more about that, as well as also, I think that is an interesting way where it kind of links this to these broader stories of capitalism on the one hand, and kind of the environment and Anthropocene and all of that on the other hand, specifically in terms of how modern consumerism and modern oil consumption and things like this are very much predicated on the kind of erasure of these, of where things come from, whether it's labor and factories, whether it's raw materials. And so I wonder just if you could maybe say a little bit more about that.
So let me start with the process of securitization, and then I'll move to that invisibilization. So which go hand in hand, and it'll become clear. So you actually mentioned New York, and I think you're absolutely right. Red Hook, which is where the port used to be for the city of New York, and which appears on the waterfront and all these other films that were about the docks in New York, has now become a kind of a pleasure area. It's a bit like the Vieux-Port in Marseille, for those who've been to Marseille, which was, we used to be the primary port, and then it sort of ends up becoming where all the bars and restaurants are, and it becomes kind of a leisure location. In both instances, the port was moved further out a little bit in Marseille, just, it's a walkable distance from the Vieux-Port, where they could then handle bigger ships. And then that actually has now become a sort of a cruise ship terminal. So it has become also incorporated into the life of leisure and pleasure, and at least for the tourists in Marseille. And the real port of Marseille has been moved to Fos-sur-Mer, which is about 40 kilometers out from Marseille. The same has more or less happened with Red Hook, where the port of New York now is actually in Elizabeth in New Jersey. And so those processes are fascinating, because on the one hand, the explanation often given for this is, Alan Sekula wrote about this 25 years ago, is that you need a turning basin for the big ships, you need warehouses for the whatever, for all of the for all of the goods that are coming in, but also importantly, you need warehousing space in order to have all of the containers that are arriving. And so you need a lot more space. Many of these ports were much smaller and they were in the center of towns. But as Mark Levinson has written, and as Deb has also written, Deb Cowan has also written, it becomes incredibly clear that another function that this kind of a logistical distancing of these infrastructures from the city center does is to isolate the workers from the city. It is an incredibly, whether it's deliberate or it's an unintended consequence that is fortuitous for capital, what it does produce is a kind of an isolated dockers community which cannot call on the support of the city. So one of the things that became clear when I was doing my research was the extent to which, and for example, in the strikes in the port of Aden, and there were loads of these strikes, or strikes in, for example, some of the ports in which are kind of hard to believe for people because of the ways in which labor regimes in those places have become quite repressive. The strikes in Qatar and Abu Dhabi and Kuwait, the port workers, seafarers often called on the support of the public. And so actually having a port that is securitized and made distant cuts some of those basic relations which are necessary for mobilization. So that's the process of securitization, which I think feeds into this, but also attendant to the massive transformations that are happening in global logistics, which is again the emergence containerization. And what comes with that is the pushing the machinery of our movement into warehouses or out of the cities or making them invisible. A statistic that I often like to bandy about, which is quite shocking, is that in something like 30 out of the 50 states of the United States, the number one labor position is delivery driver. The number one occupation is delivery driver, as a logistics driver. And so, but we don't think about that. We don't know about that. These kinds of things, and this is a kind of a distributed, diffused labor. So when it comes to port infrastructures, there is still some concentration of port workers in the space of the port. However, as the ports become bigger and bigger, and as they move further out from the cities, it becomes also necessary, and you touched on Anthropocene, it also has environmental effects. So aside from the invisibilization and the diffusion of the workplace into these places where across the roads or into trucks or into delivery vans. Aside from that, what is also quite striking is that the creation of these mega infrastructures is devastating for the environment. So never mind the dredging, which I've written about in the book. Never mind the land reclamation, which I've also written about in the book. Some of the other kind of fashions that are arriving, that are rising now, and everybody talks about them as a kind of a panacea for everything, is, for example, blockchain used to track the lading of goods. Anybody who has been listening to this new fad of the tokens for art, the NFTs for art, or following the stuff on cryptocurrencies, will know that this is one of the most environmentally destructive things ever. I just read a statistics that I think was in, it might have been in the FT, where they said all of the gains that we have had from moving to green energy, sustainable energy, has actually been decimated by the move to Bitcoin, which consumes so much electricity. Now, if a port is going to also be using blockchains to track the lading and unlading of goods, that if it's going to use these kinds of a high energy, high intensity kind of technologies, I mean, climate change is here. It's already here, and we're just going to accelerate it in that way. And so I think that all of these processes, again, are interwoven with one another. And every day, capital invents some new way to devastate the environment around us and exploit the people that are, working in those industries.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that, bringing up Bitcoin is a really excellent point. And because this is something that I think about as well in terms of, which of our environmental impacts are visible to us and which are not. And so there's, on the one hand, this invisibilization of the ports, but then also, as you identify with things like this, just kind of our own understanding of where our carbon footprint kind of fits. And even things like this Zoom webinar, which, you know, certainly more environmentally friendly than if 65 people had all flown in from different cities. But at the same time, even through using the internet and things like this, like we don't really, it's very invisibilized in terms of the impact that this has with the servers that are required to run it, with the rare metals that are required for our computers. And so all of this, I think, definitely does connect, and then connect to that larger kind of global environmental story. And then, so in addition, so we have then on the one hand, this kind of this global story of environmental change and how this is being fueled by the growing demands of capital, both in kind of the countries of the global north, and then increasingly in countries of the global south, like India as well, and of course, like China. But the other thing that you cover in the book is just this interplay between the kind of these global effects, but also these local dynamics. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and kind of specifically what it brought to mind for me was, so I was really thinking of like Sunil Amrith's recent book Unruly Waters, for example, where he talks about this attempt by both colonial and post-colonial authorities and scientists to harness kind of the power of nature. And this whole, I mean, you know, we may not want to get into kind of definitional debates about Anthropocene and all of that, but in terms of, you know, what is kind of interesting about that category is just this way that it kind of highlights the, you know, the way in which humans take this kind of role of being separate from nature rather than part of nature. And I think that this is something we can see in, so both in these kind of projects that Amrith is discussing, like dams and stuff like that, but then also in what you talk about with the port construction. There was, I liked the one passage where you mentioned, I forget who it was, but it was someone involved in these port construction projects, and he had kind of indicated there was like a large hill or something, and he just kind of very nonchalantly said, "Oh yeah, we'll just move that out of the way." And so so in terms of kind of, I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I think it would be maybe just to ask you to speak a little bit more about that kind of relationship between, so, you know, having discussed kind of the global implications, that relationship between humans and local environments, as well as this kind of relationship between humans and nature, and this kind of how on the one hand, because I think that one thing that comes through in the book is that there is, so, you know, you discuss certainly the role of the environment in shaping human behaviors. And this is something that is very common in, you know, oceanic histories and environmental histories, especially when we're talking about the pre-steam revolution, before the steam revolution, in the age of sail, using the monsoon. But it's something that we still think about in terms of the effects of climate change on us. But then you also discuss a lot about kind of how we in turn then also are shaping those environments, and it creates this almost feedback loop. So yeah, I just wondered if you could discuss that a little bit more in terms of your research at the local level.
So it's interesting because there's also a kind of a long distance effect of this as well, because a lot of concrete, when we build massive concrete piers, massive concrete, you know, spaces in which ports operate, you have to import the sand from somewhere, because interestingly, even in arid places, Saharan sand is too eroded in too even a way and in too sort of a spherical a way to be a very good kind of aggregate used in concrete construction. And so sand is, and I'm seeing a lot of articles about that now, which is great, because people are becoming very alive to the way that sand mining, and often illegal sand mining in, you know, in rivers or in beaches are actually devastating local ecosystems, local habitats in places that have a rich riverine history, like Myanmar, like Cambodia, etc. But locally speaking, so this is one of the other things that's really fascinating. When people talk about the environment and environmental devastation, there's a kind of a leftover hangover from colonial times, where semi-arid and arid ecosystems are considered to be wasteland. I mean, this goes back all the way to John Locke. And and that kind of an imagination of these lands that are just waste, that is of no use, completely and totally does not mesh with our increasing knowledge of these ecosystems actually being incredibly rich ecologically, incredibly important in terms of sustaining not only flora and fauna, but also human life in particular ways that don't necessarily mesh with temperate climates with lots of rain. And the coastal areas in a lot of the Arabian Peninsula is actually on the Gulf side, so on the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, is actually a lot of mangroves and sabkhas. Sabkhas are salt flats. And a salt flat, you think, what survives in a salt flat? But actually it's an unbelievably rich ecosystem. And so the process of, dredging through these shore areas, ripping them apart, essentially destroys these salt flats, these mangroves, which used, for hundreds of years have had provided, for example, sustenance to fishing communities in the area, etc. On the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea is lined with reefs, and reefs are quite hard, and of course they're devastating if a ship hits them, because they could rip a hole through a ship, even steel-hulled ships, and so a lot of these reefs are being ripped out, which of course those reefs are also, particularly in the Red Sea being such an old and deep sea, it's devastating these incredibly ancient ecosystems that are also incredibly rich. Anybody who's been to Sinai, for example, to go scuba diving, knows that that entire region is unbelievably rich subsea environment. And so the construction of these mega infrastructures, but also the creation of the routes that go through them, as well as oil rigs that are just offshore forms of vessels that are dotted through the Red Sea, ends up actually devastating what are incredibly difficult to recover ecosystems, which had been devalued or considered to be a nuisance to human development rather than actually a source of sustenance.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were speaking, it was really reminding me again, actually, of just kind of the case of colonial India and the way that, especially if we look at the Bengal Delta, how much of that land was viewed similarly as being essentially kind of empty space that was to be tamed for cultivation. And so because there was, because it was this delta, these kind of very complex river systems, as well as mangrove forests, this whole attempt to kind of move cultivators into the land, viewing it as this kind of empty space that could be kind of harnessed for political economy, and then how we've seen the effects of that. And there also, just as you were speaking about mangroves, so we actually shared something recently on our social media account, which I guess I should tell people in the audience to follow if they don't, the Belt and Road in Global Perspective on Twitter. But so this was about the long-term decline in mangrove forests. And so it was this study, this remote sensing study, that found that along the along the paths that are kind of, that constitute what's called the Maritime Silk Road, there's been a 21.5 decline in mangrove forests from 1990 to 2015. And I mean, I would imagine that in the last 6 years, that certainly hasn't, reversed in any way. It's probably only accelerated. And mangroves, of course, are highly important for kind of, at least based on my understanding, for regulating things like flooding, because they're able to kind of, especially as we have rising sea levels and in places like the Bay of Bengal that's very prone to cyclones, they can help to kind of mitigate those effects. And so this is the other kind of irony, and that I thought came through well in the book, is that through this process of what kind of we as humans regard as being that we are taming nature, what we're often doing actually is kind of, because we're moving in without fully understanding the larger ecosystems that we're disrupting, we're actually creating then, and that's where it becomes kind of cyclical. We try to tame nature, and in doing so, we actually create worse consequences for ourselves by totally getting rid of those kind of natural checks and balances that that the planet has kind of already carefully designed for us.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, really interesting. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to kind of move us into a bit more kind of tangibly into the discussion of the Belt and Road, and kind of set us up for the question period. And so that's just with one final question that has to do with Chinese labor. So it plays a key role within the history of global capitalism and empire. We can see this from the Pacific coast of North America, the construction of railroads across North America, as well as throughout the Indian Ocean world, in places like Southeast Asia, as well as in Africa, and all of this, long before the introduction of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I was really interested in one of the quotes that you provide, which is from, I believe it's a Yemeni Ethiopian author, Muhammad Abdul Wali, his short story, The Chinese Road. And you returned to this as well in your London Review of Books piece. And so I'd also invite you to maybe draw on that piece a bit, or talk a little bit about kind of what your goals were with that piece, or kind of the intervention that you were making there. But so just in terms of kind of framing that as a question, I was wondering to what extent the long-term histories of Chinese migration, labor, and capital in the Indian Ocean world are instructive for understanding the dynamics of the current Belt and Road Initiative, or to what extent should we be deploying a totally new set of analytical tools for understanding the nature of this relationship today, given that there is a pretty profound geopolitical shift if we're looking at kind of the 1970s versus today in terms of kind of how China is positioned on the world stage. So yeah, inviting you to talk a bit about that, but then also kind of if you want to kind of elaborate a little bit more on your contribution to the LRB piece.
I'll actually start with the LRB piece, because I think that it's quite useful as a way of framing what my aim was. So one of the things that was really quite striking for me when I was doing preparation for that LRB piece, so I was reading everything that I could get my hands on about the BRI. Obviously, BRI had loomed quite large in my project itself, but I just wanted to read, I wanted to read about the BRI outside of Arabian Peninsula. Of course, as you mentioned, the story that I have by Muhammad Abdul Wali is a wonderful story called The Chinese Road. And it is, it was actually really fascinating for me. And reading that story, it struck me that maybe the way that I should frame the LRB piece was not to write about the BRI from the Chinese perspective, and certainly not from the North Atlantic perspective, which is raring for a Cold War. I was just reading somewhere recently that one of the U.S. foreign Senate committees that works on foreign policy is thinking about allocating something like $300 million to do bad press, essentially, against the BRI. They're going to be paying local newspapers in places where BRI. So obviously, it's being seen as a threat to the North Atlantic, and the Europeans are taking up the same kind of story as the US. And I thought, what if we look at the BRI not from those two perspectives, but from the perspective of those in Asia and Africa who were in whose countries these infrastructure projects were taking place? And so I dug up the writings from those perspectives, and and I ended up going on like message boards in Kenya, where people had been discussing the BRI, especially around the Mombasa port, but also the railway that is going through there. And obviously I was limited by language limitations. I couldn't go and do message boards in all languages in Kenya. Many of these message boards were in English, so that was a little bit easier. I could, and then there were some really fantastic anthropologists have done some really great research. Interestingly, as somebody who trained as a political scientist, I'll put my hands up and say that anthropologists have actually done the best research about this, because the kind of research that they've done is about the thing that I was talking about, the texture mixture of these massive seismic changes and how those affect the lives of the ordinary people in these places, in and around those infrastructure projects. And the response was extremely mixed. I mean, in many of these places, there is a desperate need for the kinds of infrastructures, precisely because during the colonial era, they were denied them. So the rail, for example, connecting Mombasa to Nairobi and then supposedly going, to the Great Rift Valley, when the British were in charge of these railways, they didn't care about connecting urban centers to each other. They were interested about connecting the mines to the sea where the stuff could be shipped. And so there is a need for the kinds of infrastructures, obviously. And there are shifts in the ways in which the local people in the few places that I concentrated on view the Chinese engagement there. So there's quite a lot of warm feeling towards the Chinese in places like, for example, Aden, even now, even today, or in Sana'a, but perhaps not such a warm feeling in places like Sri Lanka or in Kenya. And there is also an awareness that in part, this is because of either the lack of capacity or the unwillingness of the local elite to be able to challenge the particular ways in which these projects are shaped. So, for example, in Ethiopia, where the state had the capacity to negotiate with the Chinese, there was actually quite a lot of successful provisions in Chinese infrastructure projects where Ethiopians were employed. There was technical knowledge exchange, et cetera, But in other places where those kinds of negotiations were not done successfully, this didn't occur quite in the same way. So that was also quite striking for me. So the Chinese have invested in many of these instances as a form of development aid, in many instances as kind of zero interest loans, which they keep getting renegotiated to be paid in the future. So they're not quite as rapacious as they're sometimes portrayed in North Atlantic press. But at the same time, there was actually the concerns that people had, interestingly, whereas most of the talk in Europe and North America is about debt swap processes and the way that this might cause Chinese control over these infrastructures. Most of the discussion in those places which were recipients of these infrastructures were actually about workers, the condition of the work sites, as you say, about the Chinese workers that often come there, and again, people who had memories of Chinese infrastructure projects in the immediate post-colonial era, like in the 50s and 60s, was the sense that back then this was about solidarity, and now it's much more about a kind of a capitalism with the Chinese face. It still doesn't come with the gunboats in the way that the imperial powers did in the 19th century and early 20th century, but it's not also the South-South solidarity of knowledge transfer, of the sense of standing together for something. So to me, that kind of a mixed report was really interesting and really quite important to talk about in that instance.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really kind of close to heart to what I think we're aiming to do with the U of T project. It's really aiming at understanding these. Ed's term for it is the kind of downstream effects, but so thinking about this in terms of downstream or mid-range or local effects, and really thinking about moving beyond this kind of binary view of the BRI that is very much either focused on China or focused on kind of the US or kind of Anglo-American responses to the BRI, and instead looking at what does it actually mean for local communities in local contexts? How is it feeding or contributing to or shifting patterns of migration, labor, things related to the environment, how it's kind of connected with contested politics. So I think that's definitely something that is definitely, I think there's a lot of need for that. I think within kind of, certainly within public discourse, but within the scholarship as well. And I think that's something that we're trying to do, is bring together more of these different perspectives, and maybe part of what has kind of I think there are a lot of people who are doing this work, but because of this simple fact that it is locally grounded work, it's not these aren't necessarily happening in conversation with each other. And so I think it's really valuable to be able to bring together, scholars and activists who are working on these changes in Ethiopia, along with, Sri Lanka, along with Pakistan, along with Myanmar, and then kind of thinking through then, because it really, does have the potential to be either highly transformative or not, right? To be either kind of a continuation, like you say, capitalism with Chinese face, a continuation of older processes, or to be something different. And so I think that understanding that, beyond this kind of binary perspective is really the most useful way of doing that. And so I wanted to just return then, and we do have some questions from the audience, so I'll open those up in just a moment. And I do encourage those in the audience, if you want to just type out your question in the Q&A, I'll be happy to get to them. But so just before we close, because we had kind of mentioned that we'd be returning to it, in terms of just thinking about the kind of how, the violence of infrastructure, returning to this point, because I know that this is central not only to your recent work, but to your older work as well, the logistics of violence and the violence of logistics in a way. And so thinking about, how do those dynamics feed into these projects, whether in terms of thinking about from a larger kind of Chinese state building process, looking at Xinjiang, for example, or within local contexts, such as like Gwadar Port and kind of the Balok resistance to it that we've seen in some quarters.
So, so also one of your attendees actually asks a question that can nicely allow me to talk about this. And the anonymous attendee says, I wonder if you might also be speaking on what it means to write about violence. How does one do it in a scholarly sense? How do we make a case and parse through all contradictions, the scales and systems that make violence possible? So there's a very specific question of how do we think about violence when we're thinking about the Chinese, the BRI? And then there's this broader methodological question, and I think I can address that. So the more specific question is that is also an extremely mixed and ambiguous situation, because as you mentioned, Xinjiang is an area where a lot of the Eurasian, where a lot of the fast trains that are going through the Eurasian landmass pass through Xinjiang, and we know that there are at least 1 million people being interned or being forced to work in cotton fields to produce textile or in factories. In Myanmar, the terminus of one of these rail branches goes through the Rakhine state, which is where the Rohingya people have been subjected to extraordinary violence, expulsion, rapes, etc. You also mentioned Gwadar being in Baluchistan, and there having been a decades-long struggle for autonomy there as well. So all of this happens in concert with this process of infrastructure construction. And I think to understand this is there are several factors. One, we have to look at the extent to which the Chinese, both government and businesses, because this is not just the Chinese state doing this kind of thing. There's also private enterprises as well as state-owned enterprises involved in the process of infrastructure construction, and the extent to which they are also involved in a kind of a security, process. And beyond the sort of South China Sea in which China projects coercive naval force, it really, in most of the rest of Asia and Africa, it does not have the kind of military presence that, say, a US has. So the only base that it has outside of its own immediate periphery is in Djibouti. And I think that is actually quite significant. And Djibouti hosts some ridiculous number, and it's ridiculous because it's I'm dying to go to Djibouti because it just seems to me like such an interesting place, because there's a French base and there's an Italian base and there are German guys who are apparently in the Hilton Hotel, military guys who are in the Hilton Hotel permanently, and then there's the UK, and then there's Saudis, and there's the UAE, and then the Chinese and the Japanese, and the Chinese have also set up, you know, a base there, and it's the only base they have outside of their immediate periphery. So that's also quite significant, because the US has, you know, a fluctuating number of bases, anywhere between 700 to 800 and something bases throughout the world. And to me, that comparison is quite necessary to make. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the interesting element of the extension of the BRI is the extent to which firms that are involved in providing security protection. So there's quite a lot of private security that is being provided. Many of those firms are based in China, but actually a significant number are not necessarily, or even if they are China-based, like headquartered in Hong Kong, or sitting on the Hong Kong on the various kinds of Chinese markets, stock markets. Eric Prince, famously of Blackwater, for example, runs one of these frontier services group, which provides logistical security to the Chinese. So that to me is also interesting, because that in a sense, it becomes a kind of a joke to say that the Chinese are operating separate from the, you know, the global webs of capital. They're completely and totally embedded in it, in a way that neither the Chinese nor the North Atlantic Anglophone anti-Chinese New Cold War kind of proponents are willing to admit. They are completely interwoven, and so those are also quite important elements that we have to think about. But perhaps the most significant is the extent to which the infrastructure projects intensify or de-escalate the processes of state violence against people seeking autonomy in the particular countries in which these infrastructure projects are taking place. And historically speaking, looking, for example, you mentioned earlier of Chinese workers who worked on railroads in the Pacific region in both Canada and the US. And those railroads, which were built in order to consolidate the hold of a central state over the frontier, were also enormously significant in dispossessing Indigenous Americans, First Nations in both Canada and the US. They were instruments of extraordinary violence, both, and again, Deb Cowan is working on this project in Canada. But we know this history, you know, so those infrastructure projects are often not innocent. They often bind peripheral regions in very violent ways, both commercially and militarily, into the center. In other instances, an infrastructure can act as a kind of an redistributive project. And I think it's really important to, when we're looking at a Gwadar, it's also important to think about those instances where an infrastructure project planned by a local government and supported or funded by or constructed by the Chinese actually acts to bind in areas that haven't received their fair share, for example, of the national allocation of budgets. And the bits that I wrote about that, we had to edit because of the length of the piece, but I think it's also important to look at some of those instances. So the violence works in a lot of different ways. So this is about the specificities of violence. Now, in response to your to the anonymous questioner, I think writing about violence, again, it's quite difficult because there are different scales of violence, and for me, through most of my academic career, it's been really important to talk about the intimacy of so much of the violence, which we often think about from afar. So the counterinsurgency is quite intimate because it's face to face, but, you know, bombing that destroys your house, or the kinds of security incursions into your area in order to build a railroad or in order to build a port, or to break a strike. I think that's also quite important to mention, because there's a lot of strike breaking going on in all of these kinds of projects. I'm talking about my my particular project, but also some instances of strike breaking in, for example, infrastructure projects that the Chinese managed. And I think those violences are really important to write about. And I often think that it is really important to write about them at all of those different scales, using different methodologies, because I think that on the one hand, it is significant and quite important to get the voices of those who've been subjected to violence out there. but also and let them speak for themselves. But also, it is important to do the sort of the broader analysis that situates that violence not only in a longer history that ties it to sort of developments in commerce or war, but also locates it geographically in a much broader context, so that we understand it as being part of global ebbs and flows of violence, as part of transformations in the ways in which war is fought, or counterinsurgency is fought, or policing is fought. And so I think, to me, that writing about violence has done all of these different things through the 20 years or so that I have been doing so.
Sure, thank you. So I'd just like to give you the opportunity for if there's anything else that you wanted to kind of discuss yourself in terms of the book. Yeah, just if there's anything else you wanted to cover, you're kind of very welcome to do so. And then if not, I'll kind of open up maybe more of the questions.
No, I think I'm good. I think I tend to talk a lot, and I just go on, and so maybe it's best to answer the questions more specifically.
Sure, although certainly I don't think anyone minds. Sure. So we have a question here from Thomas Bruce, who appreciates the talk and is looking forward to reading the book. And so he's asking about the effects in terms of state building, the effects, if any, of the increased deployments of US-led naval forces from 2001 on. So not only in the Arabian Gulf, Jabal Ali, Straits of Hormuz, but other ports and states these warships pass through repeatedly. And so he notes that from his own impression from a deployment in 2003 was that these forces were mainly geared towards protecting so-called choke points and merchant traffic, but had unintended effects on these places, ranging from migrant labor to infrastructure.
So that's a fantastic question, and I actually have a whole chapter that deals with the ways in which the regular sort of deployment of war, and actually in the region since 1970 something, has actually been an incredibly significant factor into the construction of these infrastructures. Thomas probably knows that the Jabal Ali is actually the port of R&R in the region for the US Navy ships that are there. And of course, the port of Bahrain is the home of the Fifth Fleet, and Qatar has a major CENTCOM base in it, massive, although not Navy in that instance. And so I think that the presence, all of these presences actually result in interesting and complex relationships between the militaries and the management of those ports, but also the kind of businesses that crop up around them. So, for example, I write about this in the book, and I think it's worth mentioning here, is that when the US went in 2001, it used Jabal Ali as one of its deployment places for the war in Afghanistan, and then it slowly built up forces in the region in preparation for the war in Iraq in 2003, and all of that resulted in businesses cropping up in all of these places that transformed from being multi-million-dollar places to multi-billion-dollar businesses in trying to sort of feed into the logistical needs of the US military. So enormously important. Again, mentioning Deb Cowan, she talks about the way that some of the former US military bases in Iraq were transformed into logistic cities. This kind of a fungibility between the commercial and the military. In the case of Jabal Ali, I'm working on a paper about the mission to seafarers, and I've recently been going through their archives. And one of the things that is unbelievably striking about their archives is the constant presence of various US and British and other foreign warships that are coming into these ports, which the mission to seafarers are serving. And, you know, that generates enormous amounts of of business. It brings in third-party country or third country workers that work in these places and are exploited. And again, I write about this quite extensively, but war is very good business for these ports that do sort of support work, or they're logistical nodes essentially for the various US wars that it fights in the region, whether they are sort of low intensity, ongoing, constant monitoring, or they are kind of full on violence. In terms of the choke points, one of the things that was really, for me, really interesting in both of the container ship trips that I took was that when you went through the Bab al-Manda being the 11-mile, 13-mile wide opening to the Red Sea, which Aden is on one side of it, as Djibouti is on the other side of it, more or less. When you're going through there, and of course, parts of that route around the Arabian Peninsula back in 2004 or so were quite intensely securitized because of piracy, because Somali piracy. And it's not so secure. It's not the incidences of piracy have gone from being like 400 in a year to being maybe 4 or 10 or something in recent years. Nevertheless, when you're going through that area, one of the things that you see on the AIS, automatic identification system of the ship that you're going on, is a number of warships that there are going through. And often you know that they're warships because they either blank their names or they don't actually appear. So you're seeing them out of the window of the wheel room, but you don't see them on the AIS because naval ships shut, and there's no identifier on most of these ships except for a number on the side. So I had to write down the numbers on the side because I didn't have Wi-Fi, and just come back when you arrive in port. You actually, if you look up the number on the side of a ship and you enter it into Wikipedia, God bless Wikipedia, it has actually tells you exactly which navy it belongs to, when the ship was built, what its name is, and where it is deployed right now. So it's absolutely fascinating to see how many ships there were. There were Indian ships, Chinese ships, Italian and Dutch ships, EU naval force ships, and on a couple of occasions, both a French aircraft carrier and a US aircraft carrier. So yeah, these are incredibly securitized. The waters around here are incredibly securitized, and the kind of arrival into port of these massive ships and these huge, massive number of ships that are going there, whether they're for victualling or for R&R or for bunkering or whatever, really does affect the business environment, the commercial environment, the political environment in those ports as well.
Sure. So there was also just a comment that I'll just address, just in terms of that by 2024, China's Bitcoin energy needs are set to surpass those of the entire country of Italy, just on that point. So in terms of the next question, the question is, what were your goals in writing the book, and who is the book intended for in terms of readers outside of academia?
So one of the primary aims that I had in writing the book was to actually de-exceptionalize the politics of the Arabian Peninsula. A lot of the work that is written about the countries of the Arabian Peninsula, in particular the Gulf, falls into two categories. Either really innovative, fantastically amazing, really interesting historical works, or much more recent works that tend to be, although that is changing slowly and in a very exciting direction, or more works that focus on more contemporary eras, but which either focus on securitization, as in security, geopolitical security, alliances, etc., kind of tribal politics, and I put tribal in quotes, or Dubai as bling. Whereas, as I said, this is changing now, and there are more interesting works emerging, which are really exciting. But also they tend to, as I said, kind of make it seem like a lot of these places are quite exceptional. For me, what was fascinating was how similar Dubai was, for example, to Singapore in many ways. And so that it was important for me to make sure that this became clear. It also was really important for me to talk about a sort of a history of the Arabian Peninsula, which wasn't solely about oil. Although oil plays an enormously important role in this, there's so much else going on, which is fascinating and really interesting and politically significant, which hasn't been covered. And so I really wanted to do that too. In terms of which audience I've written it for, when I was about to write it, I asked my editor in Verso, I said, I really want to reach a broader audience. What model should I use as a model? So what kind of book, give me a book that I can think of. And he said Mike Davis's City of Quartz, which is a theoretically grounded, enormously, I mean, of course, I can't aspire to be Mike Davis, and that book is, you know, a classic, but what I wanted to do was do what Mike Davis does. Whether or not I succeed is a different question, but to actually tell stories which are coming up out of a certain set of theoretical and political commitments, coming out of quite a lot of empirical research, but which are available and accessible to a broader audience who's not necessarily Middle East experts, who are not necessarily maritime experts, and to make it interesting to them, to answer some questions, to sort of, when you walk away from the book, if you've learned 1 or 2 or 3 things about maritime transport, then I'm quite happy about that.
I also will just say that you have succeeded in that sense.
Wow.
But we can certainly leave that to the audience as well to determine. There is a question here about Jabal Ali and questions of labor exploitation and labor resistance in Arabia. And I think this ties to what you were saying earlier about kind of thinking about Arabia through a lens that wasn't kind of purely in terms of oil or geopolitics. And so, yeah, I wondered if you could answer that.
So Djibouti is fascinating. Djibouti is one of, I'm sorry, I lost track a little bit. Were you asking me about Jabal Ali or Djibouti?
I was just asking about the Jabal Ali one. Because
okay, so sorry, you okay. Yeah, I was
sorry.
like, yeah. Okay, so Jabal Ali, the developments in Jabal Ali are really interesting because it's as I said, a hugely enormous port, and the way so Jabal Ali is distinct also from some of the other ports that I have studied and written about in the book, because some of the other ports that I write about and have studied in the book go back to, you know, their histories go back to at least some of them actually go to the 19th century. Dubai itself, but not Jabal Ali, also goes back to, you know, far longer than that. But some of them, some of the actual modern harbors were built in the 1930s. Jabal Ali is much, much newer. You know, they started really construction in it in the late 1970s, and it only opened in the 1980s. And so part of the, you know, wanting to talk about the way that labor exploitation happened around it was 2 stories. I wanted to tell a story first of the construction of these places, and then the way that they were working now in the port, the dockers that were working in the ports. And the construction process, again, Jabal Ali, because it's a much more recent one, there's, you know, there are people who can talk about the construction process, and there was very distinct particular ways in which particular categories of people were brought in to work on these ports that could be exploited, could be disciplined. Often they were barracked into places so that they would not be interacting with local populations. And in the case of Jabal Ali, many of the workers were brought in from South Asia. In a lot of the older ports, actually, what and this is also something that I write about in the book, and I encourage you to read that bit of the book if you are interested in this. Is one of the things that becomes really clear is that up until, let's say, the late 1960s and early 1970s, what one finds is unbelievable ferment in on the docks in a lot of these ports, and that unbelievable ferment is happening because the dock workers are often local. They're Qataris, or they're people from Abu Dhabi or Bahrainis or whatever. And they also are working alongside other Arabs. And the other Arabs are from countries like Egypt or Syria or Lebanon, Palestine, or Jordan. And in many of these instances, the businesses on the docks, or the states, the local state ruling states, were wary of, for example, disciplining or being too violent or coercive against many of these other Arab workers, because, for example, the government of Egypt demanded certain guarantees about the working condition of its workers if it was going to be sending workers to I don't know, Abu Dhabi or Qatar. But also significantly, and I think this was quite important, was that there was, of course, the idea that these emirates were being supported by the British. They were being protected, literally, they were protectorates being protected by British in an age of decolonization. and where, for example, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was a kind of a hero of decolonization in the Arab world. And so these forms of protest on the dock could go on in all sorts of ways, and people spoke the same language, and they could mobilize, and they could bring in information from other places. And interestingly, some of the nodes from which strikes rose were places we cannot, today it would be hard to imagine, but for example, Kuwait, the people in the British managers of the oil docks in Qatar or Abu Dhabi were constantly worried about Kuwaiti workers, sending pamphlets or brochures or mobilizing people across the waters. So this was such a threat to the processes, to both strategic and economic financial interests of the British in that particular instance in these places. And of course, the history of suppression in Saudi Arabia goes a little bit further back. It goes to the 1950s, where the Saudis, under the tutelage of the United States, banned any form of political mobilization, strikes, etc., in the 1950s, in response to, again, forms of quite strong activism and strikes. But with the Emirates, most of these little Emirates, the British very specifically planned to re-engineer the labor pool in such a way as to be able to break them up through policies of linguistic divide and rule, etc., etc. And I write about this in some detail. And you find that policy has continued on in the post-independence era, to the point that you have different peoples of different kin groups or linguistic groups working in different areas, resulting in all forms of divide and rule, and also their work rights are severely limited. In none of the states of the Gulf can migrant workers, for example, join a union, even if there are unions, as there are, for example, in Kuwait and Bahrain. And so I think these are leftover legacies of British control in those places. And some of those transformations have been devastating to the migrant worker populations that have actually built these emirates. So that chapter is one of my favorite chapters, in part because a lot of research went into it, a lot of archival work, but it also drew from my conversations with a lot of the people that have, been active either from near or from afar in trying to address these kind of the desperate labor inequalities there.
Sure, absolutely. So there was a question on Djibouti. I mean, you did kind of already cover a bit about Djibouti. If there's kind of anything more you wanted to add to that, then certainly feel free. But I'll also just bundle the final question here, because I think it should be a fairly quick one. It's just in terms of what are some books you recommend for emerging scholars writing on violence in broader terms that have been important for you? And then after those two, we do just have a quick one from Ed Chats as well.
Okay. In response to the question on violence, the kind of violence that you want to write about, obviously it differs from location to location and from time to time and from place to place. And the kinds of violence, are we talking about policing and war? And in many instances they converge. So I'll just say one book that was enormously important in the way that I thought about a lot of this stuff when I was writing my counterinsurgency work, and that was Alan Feldman's Formations of Violence, which is about Northern Ireland. Absolutely amazing book. But I also encourage you to write to me and tell me a little bit about your project, and I'll be very happy to provide you with a list. Because I think this is a kind of there's so many books out there about violence, but do please write to me and I'll be very happy to talk to you about it. As to Djibouti, Djibouti was, of course, a French colonial outpost. And I think that in some ways, one of the things that makes it such a sort of a significant location, and the reason why there's so many different military bases there, is because it sits on the Bab el-Mandab, which is, of course, one of, as we now discovered when the Suez Canal was shut down, 12% of the world's trade goes through Bab el-Mandab up or down Suez Canal. And so a lot of these bases are there to sort of project the power of those who have those presence there, and to ensure the flow of commerce through Bab el-Mandab. I also think that the Djiboutian politicians are incredibly careful about balancing all of these different forces against one another. And so you can have the Chinese and the Japanese and the US and the Europeans sitting there precisely in order for them to be able to avoid becoming the client to only one of these particular powers. And they have done that quite successfully also commercially when it comes to, for example, the operation of the Dolore port there, where they have played off Dubai Ports World, or actually the Chinese against Dubai Ports World, because Dubai Ports World was rapaciously running down that port. And so interestingly, they are doing the kind of necessary playing off of the major powers in order to protect both themselves, but also the country itself. So Djibouti is a really interesting place. And as I said, I would love to go and visit. The person who has written about it, in case you're interested, is Jatin Dua, a fantastic anthropologist who also writes about shipping in the Red Sea and has done a bunch of research there. So again, their name is Jatin Dua, D-U-A. Fantastic work. They've got a book out, so you can probably find a little bit more about that if you're interested.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time, but maybe just quickly from Ed. So he thanks you for the terrific talk, and just would like to know if there are questions that you'd love to have answers to, but that for problems of access, power, ethics, etc., you weren't able to address within the book.
Yes. So for ethical reasons, I was really curious about the sort of the social and intimate life of the seafarers aboard the ship, but it is not something that I'm even comfortable mentioning here. So that's definitely something that I would love to know a little bit more about, but I don't think it has to be done incredibly sensitively, and I'm not entirely sure that you know it can be anything but salacious. So that was ethically, I chose to step back from that. Politically, I would absolutely, oh my God, I would so love to be able to go into one of Aramco's ports on the Gulf. Ras Tanura or Dammam or Dahran. I mean, it's just, I would so love to go. And of course I can't go. So not even all Saudis can necessarily access these. These are some of the most highly securitized places in the world. And I so would love to go and talk to people and interview people, but obviously that's not going to happen. So sadly, yeah.
All right, well, with that, we have reached our time. We're actually right on time, so that's quite good. So I do just want to really thank you again, Laleh, for joining us. I have so enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure that our audience members have as well, and that it's given us a ton to think about. Again, I do really encourage everyone in the audience to get your hands on a copy of Sinews of War and Trade. It's a great book. The discussion here really only scratched the surface of just a very complex but very accessible text. So I do encourage everyone to read it. And again, I just, on behalf of the Belt and Road Project and my colleagues, I would love to thank Laleh once again for joining us today.
So much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, Ed, and Joseph. And thank you so much, Joseph, for this incredibly generous reading and really fun conversation. Thank you. I'm very grateful. And thank you to the audience for coming and for your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I hope that we can
so
definitely, yeah, next time.
So great.
Thank you.